I would like to open on a note of gratitude, just to say I'm so thankful for the last couple of days. I thank you for welcoming a stranger. You don't feel like I'm a stranger anymore, because I don't feel as if you are. I've learned a lot from being here and enjoying the faculty and others, and it's my hope that I'm also able to leave you with a few thoughts that may be useful. So toward that end, what I'd like to do today is keep this to about 30 minutes, assuming I can figure out how to on my phone, because I'm talking about something that I know you have constant experience of, which is the phenomenon of secularization and the question of what, if anything, might be done about it. So I know everyone in the room will have thoughts, and therefore I'd like to present some of the argument in my book, How the West Really Lost God, and then open it up to conversation. I'm not able to figure out the stopwatch, so at 25 minutes, if anyone would like to do a jumping jack, I will tailor accordingly. So I would like to start with a thought experiment, a kind of a radical, which is what causes secularization. On the surface, this is a simple question. It's only 3 words long, and it seems as if all of the towering apparatus of social science with its metrics and spreadsheets, etc., should be able to answer it. And yet, at the same time, what causes secularization is a radical question. That's because ever since the Enlightenment, the conceptual tables have been turned on religious believers. Ever since the Enlightenment, it has been supposed in many sophisticated circles that religious belief is the outlier, that religious belief is the thing that needs to be explained. And that's why I say what causes secularization is a radical question, because it turns the conceptual tables around on that long-running conversation about religion in the Western world. After all, evidence from all over human history shows that humanity, generally speaking, is theotropic. It leans toward God. Humanity, in every language we know, is inclined toward transcendence. So when measured against the sweep of human history, it is in fact secularization, not religiosity, that demands explanation. So the first point I would make is that the way we are accustomed to thinking about secularization is upside down. Now, this question of how societies that were once religious have become markedly less so is one of the most fascinating historical puzzles in the world. So maybe we should put some flesh on this idea of what is secularization. Here are a few facts from around Western Europe. Church attendance has gone over a cliff during the last quarter century especially. In Great Britain, Christians will be a minority of the population even sooner than expected. In fact, within less than a decade. Now, in some Catholic circles, it has become common to argue that this is just some kind of Protestant problem, which is convenient for some people, but also is not true. Something like 15% of the population of Catholic Venice attends Mass every Sunday, and that is particularly emblematic because Catholics are taught that missing Mass on Sunday for any but the gravest of reasons is a mortal sin. Catholic Spain does not measure up any better, and on it goes across the continent and into Canada, New Zealand, Australia, etc., including in the United States, where a steady rise of none of the above has been documented, as we all know, especially among younger Americans. And in addition to measures like these of secularization, I would add some others that are evocative, if harder to pin down, like the commercial success of the new atheism 10 years ago or so, the growth in public animosity toward Christianity in many parts of the West, including influential precincts like Hollywood and Silicon Valley, and changing legal norms, etc. So secularization isn't just about who shows up in church, it's also about these other cultural forces. Now, just as for a while it seemed like the Catholics could blame the Protestants for this and say, well, it's just a Northern or a Western European thing, we now know better, because even far more religious Poland, for all of its devotion, is not immune to these same trends. Poland's Statistical Institute of the Catholic Church, for example, reported that weekly attendance at Mass was 53% in 1987, which is quite high by European standards. But by 2011, it had dropped to less than 40%. And Poland is also roiled by the same culture war questions that the United States and other Western nations are, including most notably abortion. So similarly, the United States, of course, remains considerably more religious, as measured by both belief and attendance, than any country in Western Europe. But in the United States, too, after a lag, we're seeing the same kind of trends that we're seeing in Europe, to which many people once thought the United States to be immune. So let's move on to ask what exactly has happened here. Or as Charles Taylor put it, why was belief in God unremarkable 500 years ago, whereas now it's considered in need of explanation? Well, here's one answer that is sometimes heard, and it's an example of how in the book I walk through what are standard explanations for secularization and then point out the problems with them. So a great many people have supposed that prosperity drives out God. In the minds of many sophisticated secular people, especially, religion is Marx's famous opiate of the masses. It's a consolation prize of some kind for the poor and backward. That's the stereotype. And that is what a lot of the enlightened people around us think. Now, if this account of secularization were sound, if it correctly predicted who was religious, then we would reasonably expect that the poorer and less educated people are, the more religious they would be. So the fascinating fact is that this stereotype is not correct. One can find cases where the opposite is true. So before going to the United States, let's look at Great Britain. A British historian named Hugh MacLeod did fascinating work on historical London between the 1870s and 1914. And he published these in a book called Class and Religion in the Late Victorian City. He documented that among Anglicans in London during that period, the number of worshippers went up, at first gradually and then steeply, with every step up the social ladder. The poorest districts had the lowest rates of church attendance, and those with the upper middle and upper class populations had the highest. So this is quite in contrast to the Dickensian stereotype of the pious poor outshining and of this debauched and irreligious upper class. No, reality among the populace in London seems to have been the opposite. Only a small proportion of working class adults, MacLeod observed, attended the main Sunday church services. And similarly, another British historian, Callum G. Brown, made the same point about religiosity in England during the Victorian years, that contrary to common wisdom, he said, the working class were irreligious and the middle classes were the church-going bastions of civil morality. Now, much the same pattern can be found in the United States today, and it is one more pattern that's subversive of the idea that economic and intellectual sophistication are somehow the natural enemies of the Christian faith. A prominent book published in 2010 by sociologists Robert Putnam and David Campbell, which I'm sure some of you have read, called American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us, makes the case that religiosity in the United States is not a lower class thing. So during the first half of the 20th century, the authors said, college-educated people participated more in churches than did those with less education. As Putnam and Campbell observe, this trend is clearly contrary to any idea that religion is nowadays providing solace to the disinherited and dispossessed, or that higher education subverts religion. So my point here is not to create some ugly new stereotype according to which believers are the best and brightest and chosen, and other people don't matter. It's rather to observe that things are not what they seem to be in these matters, and that this reality calls our accepted way of looking into secularization into question. I'll give one more example. In research summarized in another wide-ranging recent book that was mentioned last night, Coming Apart, The State of White America by Charles Murray, he makes a similar point. The upper 20% of the American population are considerably more likely than the lower 30 to believe in God and to go to church. Or as a newspaper headline summarized this research, who is going to church? Not who you think. The examples of Victorian England and the United States today go to show us that prosperity and education do not drive out God. So let's look at another theory. In the sociology of secularization, some people argue that secularization is the result of the 20th century world wars. Is that true? Did men and women lose their faith in a benevolent creator when faced with the unprecedented horrors and body counts of World War II, especially the invasions, the bombing of civilians, the Holocaust, etc.? I can understand the power of this argument. I have visited Auschwitz, maybe some of you have too. It's a horrible place. It's one of the worst places on earth. And it's very hard to stare into a pit full of human ashes, as you can do there, still existent after 70 years, without wondering about the problem of evil. And no doubt some people staring into that same pit, literally or figuratively, have concluded that the problem of evil is insurmountable. Auschwitz and the rest of the totalitarian horrors, some people believe, killed God. And yet this argument for secularization fails thoroughly for two reasons. First, if that were true, it is hard to understand how countries with such different experiences of the wars, like neutral Switzerland, vanquished Germany, victorious Great Britain, would all be in a similar place today when it comes to secularization. It also does not explain why countries untouched by the wars would have followed suit. And one example would be Argentina, which is one of the fastest secularizing countries in the world. Second, and what's even more important, the end of World War II was in fact marked by a religious boom. And this occurred not only in the United States, but across the Western world. And this is a boom that is still within living memory of older people today. Church attendance was up, professions of belief were up, belief in God was up. Those years were such that Will Herberg, who was the most prominent sociologist of religion then, observed in his classic book, Protestant Catholic Jew, that the village atheist had become a thing of the past, he wrote. That's how resurgently observant America in the 1950s had become. And not only America. The religious boomlet was pan-Western in scope. And this is also something that British sociologists have documented. There are footnotes in the book for those interested. The religious boom applied to the vanquished as well as the victorious, the neutral as well as everybody else, the economically devastated as well as the prosperous. In the public realm, the rhetoric of leaders was pro-Christian in a way that would strike us today as unbelievable. German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, for example, said in a famous speech in Cologne that Germany had gone over to the Nazis because German Christianity had never been strong enough. Just imagine any public leader making a statement like that today. It's unthinkable. But it's just one of many examples that could be cited, including examples from the popular culture, like the extraordinary popularity during the 1950s of Christian themes in, of all places, Hollywood. So the point, again, is that the religious boom of the immediate post-war era in and of itself refutes two ideas. One, that Christian decline is inevitable, and two, that the world wars caused secularization. So here we have two common explanations for secularization that don't hold up, and there are, again, other examples in the book. Modern sociology can tell us many things, but about the elemental question of why people stop going to church, or why they start, theories have come up short. So rather, I would argue, and crucially, religion waxes and wanes in the world, strong one moment, weaker the next, for reasons that still demand to be understood. One answer, I think, has to do with a variable so seemingly humble as to have been overlooked by the titans of sociology. That variable is the human family. More specifically, the relationship between the health of the family and the health of Christianity. To study the historical timeline is to see that religious vibrancy and family vibrancy go hand in hand. Conversely, so do religious decline and family decline. Where you see one, you can expect the other. Now let's return again to those years of post-war religiosity as a test case. Strikingly, the religious boom overlay perfectly with another phenomenon of those same years that's been much more studied, and that is, of course, the baby boom. The baby boom itself was preceded by a marriage boom. Again, across the Western world, in country after country, the war ended and was followed by an increase in marriage and babies and church attendance. Isn't it just common sense to think that the baby boom and the religious boom didn't just happen at the same time, but that they were causally related to each other, that they were fueling each other, that each trend powered and reinforced the other? I think this is a highly suggestive example of an overlooked aspect of what makes Christianity tick. So what I'm proposing is that something about families, in fact, more than one something, increases the likelihood that people will go to church and believe in God. And I think this is so for all sorts of reasons. One is prosaic, because mothers and fathers will seek out a like-minded religious community for their children. Child rearing is hard work, and the enormity of it weighs heavily on most parents. So no wonder many seek a community to help them with it. I remember being on a radio show with a host who was a Baptist minister a few years ago talking about this theory, and it was clear that he didn't need to read How the West Really Lost God to understand it. As he said to me, every new parishioner I get is coming with a baby in arms. That's another kind of proof. And then there's another way in which becoming a mother or father appears to have an effect on religiosity. The experience of birth, of being mothers and fathers, transports many people into a religious frame of mind. That primal bond between parent and child is for most people the most powerful they will ever feel. And it's reflected in the masterpieces of history and literature. So, for this reason too, communal life within the family might incline people toward religion, and specifically toward Christianity. There is a beautiful story that's told by Whittaker Chambers in his book Witness, which goes exactly to this point, where he describes what it was that made him stop being an atheist and come back to Christianity. He was an atheist communist sitting in his apartment in New York, staring at his infant daughter, and he develops this beautiful image of looking at her ear and understanding in a sudden epiphany how extraordinary it was, how he never could have made anything like this. And he writes, "It was at that moment that the finger of God was laid on my forehead and I made the turn from atheism to Christianity." It's a beautiful image. We can't all write like Whittaker Chambers, but I think a great many people have experience of being driven to church by birth in the same way. Now, we do know from social science that people who are married are more likely to go to church than not, and that people who are married with children, especially married men, are far more likely to be found in church than single people. My point is to try and connect these dots in a way to say that they're not mere coincidences. So let's look at an example from the other end of the spectrum. So what is the most secular territory on Western Earth today? Any takers? Most secular place on Earth. That would be Scandinavia. So Scandinavia is so secular that sociologists have started studying it as the first society to do without God. Well, who pioneered the post-war unmarried Western family and its ally, the welfare state? That would also be Scandinavia. And what is the most atomized place on Earth today as measured by the number of people who don't live in a family at all? This is also Scandinavia. In Norway now, something like 40% of all households are households of one person, and in Sweden it is almost 50%. So again, the argument is that these things are related, that family is a driver of faith, and it's one example of what I dub the double helix of family and faith in the book. I don't pretend to understanding the science of the double helix, but each side requires the other to reproduce itself, and that, I think, is the image that we should keep in mind when we think about what robust families and robust churches look like, or conversely, declining families and declining churches. Each side requires the other to thrive. So looking at matters this way makes the puzzle of secularization less of a puzzle, I think. There's another potent fact that I'm just going to mention in passing, but that's also part of this picture, showing the familial underpinnings of the churches. Christianity is an intrinsically familial religion. It privileges the family, and it tells its own story via the family over and over again. This is a religion in which we are told that we are figurative brothers and sisters. It begins with a baby and a holy family, a mother who suborns herself to a child completely, and a loving adoptive father. So my point is, how could a story like that not cause confusion in a time of fractured families like our own? How can you even explain the idea of a benevolent God to a teenager who's never known such a figure, who might only know dads who are, a series of mom's boyfriends? I'm not saying it's impossible. We're told that with God nothing is impossible. But what I'm saying is that the discrepancy between God the Father and the Father, as many kids know him today, calls for creative evangelization of a kind that we didn't need before. So if your desire is to get the Christian message out, that's an obstacle that has to be considered and overcome. Another way in which the family breakdown is connected to religious breakdown is, again, prosaic, the fact of shared custody of children, in which many times kids are spending alternate weekends in different parents' homes. Well, of course, this can't help but interrupt the transmission belt of religious learning. In an essay just written in The Atlantic, a writer points to a graph about secularization, which shows that among young people, there's a fall off in organized religion that gets steeper and steeper after 1992. And the writer thinks this is some great mystery. But I don't think it's a mystery at all, because by the 1990s, you have late baby boomers becoming parents themselves. And many of those late boomers were themselves from broken homes. And the numbers keep going up, just like the numbers on that graph. In sum, the changes in family formation that are now common across the Western world make the Christian story seem more coherent or incoherent or remote to many people than it did before. To summarize, the decline of Christianity in some parts of the world is not incidental to the change in Western family patterns. These two things are joined at the root. And there was recent confirmation, again citing the Atlantic magazine, which should thank me for all the endorsements. Sociologist Christian Smith, whom some of you may know, was apparently interviewed by writer Derek Thompson. And they were talking too about the sharp decline in the numbers of young people who attend church. Thompson summarized the conversation by saying, just as stable families make stable congregations, family instability can destabilize the church. Divorced individuals, single parents, and children of divorce or single-parent households are all more likely to detach over time from their congregations. So this is exactly the thesis of how the West really lost God. I hope its analysis points the way to new grounds for hope, paradoxically, among those who wish to reinfuse our culture with a Christian spirit and Christian virtue. After all, for a long time, as everyone here knows, religious people have been told that they're on the wrong side of history, that reason and science have overruled them. But that is not what is happening in secularization. Losing God has nothing to do with reason and science, and everything to do with living in ways that have made it harder for many people to hear His voice. There is more here, but I am looking forward to a conversation because I'm sure that people will have had thoughts sparked and have analyses of their own to share. So with that, I thank you very much. Thank you.